All right, now we're ready to implement our first test case. So if the client is not logged in, we want to return a 401 error. Now, this is what I want you to do. I want you to be very active in this section. Don't just sit there, watch me coding. You're not going to learn test-driven development this way, I promise you. The only way to learn test-driven development is by doing it. So for the first test, it's okay if you see how I start with a test and then write the production code, but I strongly encourage you to get involved in the subsequent test cases. So treat every lecture in this section as an exercise. At the end of each lecture, I'll tell you next I'm going to do this test case or that test case. So I want you to stop watching, go ahead, spend 5 to 10 minutes, do the exercise, then come back, continue, watch the next lecture. All right, so now let's start writing our first test case. So back to our test suite. Let's change this to it should return 401 if client is not logged in. So here we want to send a post request to our endpoint. Let's delete all this. Now to send a request, we need to load the super test module. So on the top, require super test, get the result, which is a function, and store it in this constant request. So now back to our test, we call request, pass our server object. We're going to send a post request to /API/returns. We also want to include a valid object. So if we get an error, we know it's an authorization error. It's not to do with the content of our request. So in this object, in this body, we want to have customer ID, which we set to customer ID variable that we defined earlier, as well as movie ID, which again we set to movie ID. Now you can see this looks repetitive, so we can use the new syntax in ES6 and simply include the name of the key, like this. So this is our request. Now we await this and get the response. Now let's break this down into multiple lines so the code is more readable. So we have a response. Now all we have to do is expect that response.status to be 401. Pretty easy, right? Save. Back in the terminal, we should have a failing test. We can see that here. And we expected to get 401, but we got 404. Where did that come from? Well, we haven't implemented that endpoint. So by default, when we call an endpoint that doesn't exist, Express returns a 404 error. So let's go ahead and implement this endpoint. So back in our project, here in the routes folder, let's add a new file called returns.js. Now here we need to load Express, get a router, and define a new endpoint. Again, to save time, I'm going to go back to our genres module and borrow some code. So let's go to genres route. So we need to get the Express and router, and let's get one of these route definitions as a template. So copy, paste it here. We're going to change this to post and delete everything here. We'll get back to that in a second. Finally, we need to export the router. So module.exports, we set it to this router object. Now we need to include this router in our application object. So earlier, we added this routes module in the startup folder. Here we need to load this new module. So require routes/returns. We store this router here, returns, and then call app.use. So for any requests going to /API/returns, we want to use this router. All right, now back to our returns module. What is the simplest code that we can write to make our test pass? Let's have a look. So here's our test. All we expect here is that status should be 401. So we come back here and call response.status 401. Unauthorized. That's the simplest code we can write. Now, this may look a little bit silly for you. You may think, but we haven't really checked the JSON web token. We didn't add the authorization middleware. I know that. But this is the whole point of test-driven development. It forces you to write only the code that you really need. Maybe we'll come up with a different implementation that is far simpler than what we have done so far. So the simplest code that we could write to make our test pass is this. Now, as we write more test cases, maybe this code doesn't work anymore, then we'll come back and change it. So this is the whole cycle. Now, back to the terminal. We got 2 failing tests. Let's see what's happening here. We have this error. Listen, address in use. So when we tried to load the server on this port, we got this error. How come we didn't get this before? Well, it turns out that earlier I made a mistake. So back in the code, let's go to our integration tests. In each test suite, after each function, where we close the server, this actually returns a promise. We need to await this to make sure the server is properly closed. So save. Now we need to make the same change in other test suites. So genres. Again, here we have server.close. So let's await this, save. And similarly for the returns suite. Again, here we have server close. Let's await this. Save. Back in the terminal, all tests are passing. Beautiful. So in this lecture, we wrote our first test case. And to make this test pass, this is the simplest code that we could write. Now here's your exercise. In the next lecture, we're going to implement the second test case. Let's have a look. So if customer ID is not provided, we want to return a 400 error. So go ahead, write that test and write enough production code to make both tests pass. You will see my solution next.